Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this, our third lesson within the series of 18 that make up the developer training for Sage CRM. This is actually a second of a pair of lessons that is looking at some of the concepts associated with entities and the data model within Sage CRM. So we're going to be looking at developing the ideas that we saw in last week's lesson and looking at how they're applied in practice, because I raised questions about or raised the idea that Sage CRM dynamically changes SQL that is written within the interface, that there's a whole set of questions around what happens because of security, and we'll see as well how that develops. Part of that is understanding where SQL is used in different parts of the system, where we have to think about it. And I will be sending you off on a lot of places where you'll have to realize that there's further reading and investigation to do within the system administration guide, some of it in the developer guide, and some of it within the blogs. But let's see where we are within the overall cycle of training. So as I said, we are on this second of two lessons looking at the question of entities and the data model. And in this lesson, then we're going to start by looking at where the product is used, where SQL is used within the interface, within the blocks or the objects that make up the interface. I think we talked about the idea that when we were looking at the data types, we understood that Sage CRM has this idea that its entry types, which model the physical data types in the database with the understanding of what will appear inside the interface, actually contains a lot of application logic in there as well. So there's some cleverness that goes on inside these objects that are modeled defined in metadata and then held inside the interface. So we look at SQL inside these objects and inside the interface now. Now, in terms of when we come to using SQL, our supported database, whether it is SQL Server Enterprise Edition or Web Edition, or whether it is SQL Server Express, or whether it is an Azure SQL, CRM always uses SQL for that target database, and it always uses vendor-specific SQL. So we do have some automation inside the database around the denormalization specifically of the phone and email tables, but basically we're not introducing our own custom functions. We're always using vendor-specific functions like get date in order to carry out tasks inside the database. And you can see all of that SQL transferred to the database and working with the database. You'll see that within either the database tool itself, the trace facility of the database, or you can see inside the logs, you can see all of the data manipulation that takes place, all of the usage of the structures inside the system. And when we're looking at any of this, understanding, and we'll look in this course actually at some instances of the actual SQL that is passed from the interface or from the system into the database, and seeing how Sage CRM's application layer, the constructs and rules that are inside it, are dynamically changing the SQL that is generated. Our starting point then, if we're going to look at what goes on inside the database, is to understand that Sage CRM has a logging facility. And here you can see I've turned on SQL logging so that all queries over the threshold are being monitored. Now, the threshold happens to be 0, so everything is being monitored here in order to allow me to see what's going on inside the system. And imagine I come in to say something like the company screen and then go into the opportunity screen, opportunities list rather. That opportunities list is going to be based on a standing query recorded with inside metadata, and that happens to be a reference to a database view that is defined with inside the system and understood by metadata as well. So it can all be cached and held inside metadata so that it is able to be manipulated automatically by these internal rules of Sage CRM. So there's a view underlying this screen called V opportunity list. I happen to know that. Now, if we look at what goes on, we can see that when we request any screen with inside Sage CRM, we will get the log being completed. We'll see all of the transactions that are being generated, and here you can see that there are some transactions that are seeing which screen we're on. We're pulling back information associated with the context that we're in. Now, this is at this point just explaining really that idea of where all of this sits. But if we were to look and zoom in on just a couple of lines, understanding the screen that we saw, the opportunities list screen, then a couple of lines are very important. Because if we think about a screen like this, you notice how many account of opportunities that we have and the rows that are returned at that point. So we need to be able to understand how we get the count and how we get the data for the rows. Well, this is where we can start to zoom in on the individual statements that are generated against that particular data source. Here you can see I've got two versions of SQL, and this is starting to give you a sense that Sage CRM is going to change whatever you think the SQL is, it's going to change it. Now, we're going to see in a moment about views and the importance of views, but imagine the view is select star from V list opportunity. Well, what you'll get actually written in terms of the generated SQL is changed. It is a change statement. The first statement, in order to get the count of the rows, we'll look at a select count star from that view. And the second one will again get hold of the columns that are interested, but you'll notice that it is also doing an automatic restriction on the number of rows that are being returned. And it's doing an automatic restriction based on the context that we're in, and also on the pagination that we have for this screen. So we're not returning all rows, we're only returning the first 10 that we're looking at. But as we look at this, we'll also see that there are two versions of those two statements. First is the system administrator, and the system administrator bypasses security. And the second statement is for what would be generated by Susan May, as she looked at exactly the same screen and sees, may well see exactly the same results, because there are only those three items there. But here you can see that both of those views have been changed with additional information being added into the where clause. And this happens to be the example of where security policies are being applied in the form of generated SQL predicates. These are additional statements with different clauses within the where clause to restrict the rows that are returned and are visible to Susan May. Now, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that just raises this question that Sage CRM dynamically changes SQL. And we also see that it has to take into account the context in which the call takes place. So let's see how that might apply if we're working in the context of customizations, how we're working, say, within an ASP page, a classic ASP page, or inside the .NET. Now, this is going to give you an example. This is something that we will be meeting later in the training when we look specifically at the classic ASP API. Here you can see that I've got an example of a list block inside the system. Now, this list block is showing me that I could rely just on the default SQL associated with the list that exists in metadata, or I could change the SQL for that list. Here you can see that I can define a property for a list being the underlying SQL statement that I want to use. And that is where I have started to take ownership of the SQL definition. But it doesn't matter. To a certain extent, it doesn't matter, because if I do that, I think I'm writing select star from, in this case, project opportunity where, and then I've got a join to join the opportunity and the custom entity of the project, and I've got the contextual information defined here. You think that that's what I'm writing, and only that. But what will happen is Sage CRM will recognize that there are two entities involved in this. This is the opportunity and the project, and it will automatically add the where clauses into this in order to restrict the rows being returned for a user, and it will automatically add the pagination clause in as well, and it will automatically, because two SQL statements get fired, it will also add in the count statement in order to produce the total that appears at the top of the lists. So Sage CRM dynamically changes the SQL that you write, and this is both a good thing and it's also a pause for thought, because it means that you have to be you have to be wise to that, so that you can then go and have a look at how Sage CRM is manipulating the SQL you thought you were writing, but in the end it actually writes something else. And because it dynamically changes the SQL of what you write, it has a bearing on the way in which you can approach and some of the underlying views that you might use and the constructs that you might use, and some of the techniques. Like, you would possibly run into all sorts of problems if you tried to do some aggregation in the views, or try to do unions, etc. You could run into some interesting cases there. Coming on, we may come back into some of that, but this is where you need to go off and start to have a look at some of the blog articles talking about the way in which the interface changes SQL being used. Now, another thing about using Sage CRM and how Sage CRM uses SQL is that it obviously has to have a mechanism to allow it to bring in information in the context of the user interface. And we're going to look at a couple of mechanisms that is done. Our first mechanism, of course, is here, where we can see explicitly we are using and getting hold of contextual information, and then applying that contextual information to change the where clause of the statement. Now, if you don't understand this is fine. We'll be looking again at how we use how we get hold of context inside classic ASP pages later on, and how we get hold of context in .NET pages later on. But in the first line of code that you see there, you can see that var company ID equals CRM get context information company ID, and then that company ID variable is applied to provide the contextual limitation in the SQL clause. But it's not the only way that we do it. So there's another way in which we can do it. And this is where we can start to grab hold of some system information and contextual information and put it into different places. Now, this is a technique that is used in two locations within Sage CRM. This use of a hash code, hash U, hash L, hash T, etc. These are used in different places. These two places are when you're defining your order quotes configuration, and I think there's now also the ability in the naming of the generated files. If we look to from mail merges, but if we also look at escalation rules, we can see that we've got the ability to grab hold of certain information about the team that the user belongs to, the user themselves, their logon ID, their logon name, as well as the system time. And this is used in mostly escalation rules. And here you can see an example of an escalation rule that is doing exactly that inside Sage CRM. Now, escalation rules are, again, another topic that we're going to be talking about in a little bit, but escalation rules are a type of workflow rule which is triggered by the passage of time. So as a base interval, certain conditions within the database are going to be checked every 5 minutes, say, and if that 5-minute check triggers because of the condition, it will carry out certain automated behaviors, and that could be a notification onto the screen or an automated email out of the system or an automated change to data inside the system. Here, this particular example is setting a reminder and it's going to display a message on the screen, but you can see that it's checking to see whether a particular field in a table called the escalation table is less than the current system date and time, and whether the escalation user ID is the current user. And if that's the case, then the behavior triggers and that check takes place, as I said, every 5 minutes. That can be override into a custom interval if necessary. But that is the behavior that we have, and this allows us to get hold of that contextual information and use it in that particular circumstance. Now, another place where contextual information is grabbed and inserted into SQL, and this is another place where SQL is used within the interface, and this is within the tab SQL clause. And I'm going to show you a couple of places. If you go into Sage CRM, into just a vanilla install of Sage CRM, you'll be able to see these where they're defined. So in one location you could go to is here, as you can see, inside the system menus, and going down and looking at the My CRM menu, where you can now, the report menus, and you can start to see that you can look at administrator reports, and you'll notice that inside the tabs and reports group, you'll see that it's got an SQL clause which says the user underscore per admin has to be 3, which means they have to be a full system administrator in order to see that particular tab. That controls the availability of options within tab groups. Now, there can be different examples of doing that, but using these special characters. And here you can see another way of saying, well, if I wanted only a user ID to be equal to 4 or 5, here I could actually say U:4, 5, and that would limit it to those itemized users. That's less useful because that's pretty hard coding into it. Much more useful is to say, well, if somebody is a member of a particular team, then they can't see an access, or they can only see this screen. And here you can see that it's C:45, C standing there for the name of the table which holds the team information, called the channel table. So channel, or C:4,5, means that anyone with the primary channel ID of 4 or 5 can access that tab. You can see the usage of this inside the example data metadata table, and this is another example. If you've come into the communication area inside administration customization, have a look at the communication entity and have a look at its tab group, you'll see there the external attendees is an option which is controlled by using contextual information. Now, you can be very sophisticated about this. So you could say that I only wanted a tab to appear if there are records assigned to this particular user. And that's actually the first example that is given at the top. Now, you're only expressing this as a where clause. You're not having to do anything beyond that. If you do select star, if you want to limit to the context, you can use, as it says here, exists select star from opportunity where oppo _ assigned user ID equals user ID. Doesn't look like you're grabbing anything from the context, but it is, because the first assumption is that you are in the context of the user, and so it will always assume that where user ID is used, you're looking at the current user's information. Now, you can also refer to the entity context that you're in, and so you could limit the availability of a tab to only certain types of information. So you don't want to see a tab if that company doesn't have a service level agreement. You could do that by saying, well, in which case comp type has to have, cannot be null, so it is not null, but or comp SLA ID is not null. And you can also start to look, as it is here, on the customer type. But what you can't do is say, I want both conditions of the user, a particular user or a particular user's team, and the context of the company to apply. So you can't reference, you can reference either the current user or the entity in context. You can't reference both in the same where clause, but you can get away with it by separating them with a semicolon. So essentially you're writing two sequential SQL statements which will control the availability of a tab, and that's done like this. So comp _ type customer semicolon user primary channel ID equals 3. That works correctly, and what will happen is that a tab won't appear unless in a company screen, unless the customer is the company is a customer and the user is in the right team, which is sales in this case. Okay. Now, another place where you can manipulate SQL and use it is in the context of groups, dynamic groups specifically. So you can have control over the SQL statement that is being written. And this can be very useful because by default, when you're adding conditions into a group, so you're adding different restrictions, they are added as ands, logical ands, but you can express that, you could change that to a logical or. So you've got a little bit of flexibility in what you're doing. And you'll see if you go into a dynamic group, if you're a system administrator, you will see where you've got a button that says Advanced SQL. Just go into there and you can start to change the SQL for a group. And that can be useful for an implementation. Okay, well, we've looked there at how Sage CRM uses SQL to help it control the interface, how it restricts data coming back from things like a list block, how it can be used within the context of an SQL statement, within an escalation statement, how it can be used to make a option within the user interface display or not. We're now going to go on and see a little bit more about the usage of some of the theory of the data model and the SQL and how that all combines within cybersecurity. And just need to remind ourselves that within the context of Sage CRM, not all relationships are equal. Some concepts, we have a concept really inside Sage CRM of entities, which is closer to a logical business object rather than a strictly an entity in terms of relational theory would mean relational database theory, which would mean the lowest element of definable sort. So company, address, person, these are all entities, strictly speaking, and the links between them are the tables are the relations within the database that form up a business object. But when we tend to use the word entity, we're trying to describe not the individual tables, but rather the groupings of table, which means something to a business. So simply the business's name isn't much use. If it's going to be used to a business, it needs to be the address, the default contact, the phone number, the email addresses, the whole shooting match of information that allows an organization to correspond and interact with another organization. So it's the larger scale business object, which is the thing when we talk about an entity. And that is invariably a grouping of rows across multiple tables. And this entity concept is used all the way through Sage CRM. And it is, I'm afraid to say it, a bit of a Humpty Dumpty word, because depending on, and if you're not familiar with why I've said it's a Humpty Dumpty word, because in the adventures of Alice through the Looking Glass, she meets Humpty Dumpty and is talking to him about his use of words, and he defends himself by saying, words as I use them mean exactly what I mean them to mean. He's choosing the meaning for that particular moment. So our entity concept is slightly different when we come on to security, when it's dealt with in the context of workflow, and when it's dealt with in the context of data upload, reporting and groups, code, and even when we're doing coding as well. So when we deal with things called entities, and entity level scripting and table level scripting, which we'll meet in a future lesson. Now, entity definition is contingent on context. So where we are using the term entity, it's going to be slightly different wherever we are within Sage CRM, because it's the underlying view at that moment is going to be different. So we will use certain views for certain jobs and then a different view for another job. We might choose the entity becomes simpler in certain circumstances because a simpler view with fewer linked tables are being referenced. So views will always govern the entity and its context definition. So understanding that we have very different entity definitions at any one time. So if you were to look inside, say, the Sage CRM and just compare the differences between a lead and an opportunity, or a lead and a company, you will find very different definitions going on. But something like the definition of a company compared with the lead, which was a single monolithic table which had details of the contact and the person that you're going to talk to, move across to the company table, and suddenly you're dealing with more than 5 tables, because you're dealing with the company table, you're dealing with the person table, you're dealing with a link entity between those, which allows you to describe a relationship and the type of model that the person is within that company, called the person link. So a company, person link. Then you've got the address. You've got an address link between the company and the person, and the company and the address. And you've got a link table, which, as well as a email table and a phone table on top of that. So suddenly you've got lots of different other tables which are all joined together potentially within a view. Now, it does get to a point where sometimes we have made a choice to sidestep slightly and actually go through a point of denormalization, just to make our lives simpler in certain circumstances. But that type of thing, I'll have to ask you to go and have a look at some of the definitions that we've got and explanations that we've got on Sage, on the Sage Community Hub in the community. Now, this talks about one of the links between the person and the company table. This is the person link table. This is an example of an intersection table. There are others, say you've got person link, address link, you've got phone link, email link as well. These all are managing the company tables, but mostly, in most views, they are simplified so that they're not mentioned. So especially when you're pulling back lists of information, they can have you can work with a direct relationship between the company and the person table, because there is a direct foreign key relationship between the person and the company. Now, I mentioned that because what you'll find is that when you come on to writing your own, say, code that imports a person or moves a person from one structure to another, something that does get left off is very often the importance of the intersection tables. And so when you're working with that, just make sure that you are understanding the full data model that you're going to. As I said in the last lesson, the data model is completely discoverable. There's nothing hidden about that. You can start to see how everything joins together just by running the internal database tool to create the data model. It'll take some time because it's a biggie, but it's discoverable. Now, I want to talk about security now, because security is probably the area that changes SQL the most as we are using it. And if we think about what's going on, and just think about the simplest idea of one user might have a rule set on them that they can only see things that are in their geographical territory. So records are marked as belonging to a particular territory, and a user will have some rights on that. Now, that would mean that you can only see things that you have permission to look at. You want to restrict there, but it does change a little bit more, because not only do you have this idea of the security territory, but you also have the idea that, well, you can have a rule that allows you to see some data if you have been assigned that work. So if it has been directly assigned to you, you can see it. If you belong to a team to which that work has been assigned, you should be able to see it. And if you originally created it, you should also be able to see it in order to see it through its lifespan. Now, these are the primary entities within inside the system: cases, communication, company, lead, opportunity, and person. And these are covered by the default security matrices. So these are the things that are covered here. Intersection entities do not have those columns, but any custom entity that you add into the system using the advanced customization wizard would also have equivalent columns. You can see that they're not quite exactly the same. So notice how in the communication it's you're dealing with communication link com user ID. Within the company it's comp underscore primary user ID, and when it comes to opportunities and cases, then it's the assigned user ID column. So there's some variation, and it's whatever you called it in a primary record that will understand as one of the primary what are the security columns being used. Now the rights are cumulative. So if you are working with something like a communication does have security associated with it. But please note here that communications don't make any sense on their own, because they're always to somebody or from somebody, and that somebody very often belongs to a company as well. So the view for returning the information from about the communication will touch on the company table and the person table as well. And if the communication was concerning an opportunity, that will also be joined in as well. So in order to see any communication, you would have to have rights on its associated opportunity, person, and company. So any view would have to include those columns to allow for the security to be applied. And this allows me to drop back into this slide to give you an example of what's going on when something like the opportunity list is requested. So as you can see, excuse the way in which this is wrapped on the screen, but hopefully you can see this, that if we look at the bottom half of the screen, which talks about it being the user Susan May accessing this, you can see that the select statement that she has got, the second select statement, which is on line 10 on the slide, is starting to include reference, because this is pulling information back from an opportunity, it's pulling information back from the company, the opportunity, and also the person there. And checks are being made against all of those columns for each of the entities. So these columns for the person, the opportunity, and company are all being checked to see whether the request is valid and that access can be granted. Okay. Now let's take that a little bit further, because that's obviously seeing where the SQL is dynamically being changed. And this can, the chances are nearly everyone who's been involved in writing a report and creating their own view will have said, oh, it works perfectly with the system administrator, and then find that it doesn't work for a particular user because the user doesn't have rights on the entity, one of the entities attempting to be returned by the SQL. Now, if we are going to customize the system and create our own behavior, we need to get our heads around the definition of views and how our views can determine the behavior of the system. And so we're going to look now at tips for building views as well as creating views which allow for the display of completely derived information that has been calculated on the basis of other information. The first place to go when you are working with adding or changing an existing view is into the customization area, and you'll see that there is a tab option for views underneath there. You just examine a particular view and you can see that. So they're all held within a metadata table called custom views. Now, wherever you are doing work within the system, whether this is ahead of a new report, or you're going to create a new group, or whether you're going to create a new version of a list for displaying under the context of a particular entity, then try to create your own views. These are called user views because you've got different types. You've got core views, system views, and user views, and you want to create your user views rather than changing an existing view, and that removes the problem that Sage CRM might come along and just in an upgrade change one of those other views. Core views cannot be changed at all. You just the edit button won't appear, but the system views theoretically could be changed, but I don't want you to change them. I'd prefer you to create your own. Now, the typical views that are sometimes marked as system, because if I'm giving you a rule, immediately there'll be some exceptions, and the types of rules that you may want to fiddle around with are the merge views, the reports, and the target lists, or the groups views. So mail merge views that you might see, these are all examples of the merges, and a typical one that I nearly always change is a vmail merge case, because it doesn't provide the information that I would really want it to provide. It's minimal information around the case or the customer care issue, and I would expect you to change that. When it comes though to other behavior, well, let's have a look at what you can do with changing a view in terms of deriving information. This is where we introduce expressions in the SQL. So here's a very simple example of how we start to change something. Look at this. This is where we are calculating the number of days between 2 days. So this is the perhaps a duration or some other set of fields with the days between, the number of time between. So you've got date diff, day, open when it was opened, and the current system date. So returning it as oppo days from opportunity, where the oppo status is in progress. So this is a very simple return of information. So you can start to do that. Now, as soon as you start to do it, you run into a small problem, because Sage CRM, although it will do this, it doesn't know about that doesn't know about that expression. It's not a real column, and it's not one that is modeled in custom edits. Now, if you remember and think back to the last lesson when we talked about how you model a table and you model a view inside Sage CRM, you model typically a table, it can connect to an external table, it will infer a set of behaviors, but you then refine the behaviors for each of those fields with a custom edit. When you add in a derived field or an expression like this inside Sage CRM, it won't know about that expression. It won't know how to treat that bit of potential data coming back. Now, I can show you an example of this and how we solve it by looking at the custom list behavior. Now, do you notice here that I've logged on as a support user, somebody like somebody like Kylie Ward, and you can see that what I'm looking at is a listing of current customer service cases in play, and you'll notice that there is several that have a service level agreement that is obviously being breached. These are the red, and then there's the amber, and there's only a couple that's still within the OK boundary. Now, what we have here is what we have now is where we've got the behavior of a custom column, because if I show you the view that this is based on, so this is based on the list cases, and that's probably not the most sort of easy to understand, but there, let's say we understand it's defined here, and if I zoom in on this, we can see that an expression has been used, and the particular expression that I want us to see in here is a case statement. So we're getting quite clever by including a case statement in here, and you'll notice that it's saying case when case underscore status does not equal closed, and when case underscore SLA closed by is less than get date, then it's red. When the case status does not equal closed and the SLA amber closed by date is less than the get date, then it's amber, else green, and it's declaring this then as a new column, case underscore color. So that's evaluating color as being either red, green, or amber. But that column, case underscore color, doesn't exist in the database. It's an entirely derived alias. But there you go. You've got actual behavior showing up there. So how is this done? Well, what's done is that it's actually got entries added into both the custom edits table and the custom caption. So metadata is being used to define something or describe something that physically doesn't exist, that is calculated on the fly. So we have here, in this case, we have as though it existed, a column definition called case color, which describes the type of field that it is. In this particular case, it's described as a selection list with an associated image for each value. And you can see that it also has a corresponding caption. Now, this is described in full as in blog articles on Sage City. So you can go and find that and on Sage Partner, Sage Community Hub. You can go and find that and be able to see where we've described that. But how can we, for a column that doesn't exist, create the supporting custom edit and custom caption? Well, we've added some tools here. Again, there's a derived fields assistant that makes it easier for you where you are defining a view to be able to that makes use of a derived field to then be able to add in the appropriate metadata definition. And once it's in the metadata, it will appear underneath the listings of columns and appear as though you can then come along and change it. So that you can find the derived fields assistant on community.sagecrm.com. Okay. Now, you may need to, as we've started to sort, we saw in the last lesson, you may need to reference external databases on the same server. For example, if you've got your Sage CRM and you've got your accounting system derived there, then you can do that, and it is easy enough to reference an external database as well and bring information in to Sage CRM through the use of a fully qualified table name. And you can use this for reporting purposes, for graphing as well. Okay. Now that's just about wraps up what I wanted to say about the use of SQL within the interface, and expand on the concept of the entities. But let's see where we're going next. So where we'll be going next is thinking about the implementation of screen-based rules. So we'll actually start to do some coding here, or not. Well, some of this is not a lot of coding. It's understanding when we need to code and when we don't need to code. So we'll look at those in the next 2 lessons. So let's see if we've got any questions at this point. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.